Okay, hello YouTube. Today we're going to be going over the French defense. So the French defense happens after e4, e6, and then specifically we're going to be going over after d4, d5. We're going to be covering this move knight to c3. I'm going to do this as part one of a four-part series on the move knight to c3. This is going to be part one. We're going to be covering the MacCutcheon variation in part one. In part two, we're going to be covering other replies. In part three, we're going to be covering the Alekhine charter attack, the main lines. And in part four, we're going to be covering the Winnower variation, which is bishop b4. So in the first three videos, we're going to be covering knight f6, and in the final video, we're going to be covering bishop to b4. So after knight f6, bishop g5, the main line is, of course, bishop e7. We're going to be taking a look at the ultra-aggressive MacCutcheon variation, which is the move bishop to b4. This is kind of a wild attacking variation where both sides end up getting a lot of tactical chances, and there's a lot of very complex play. So what I'm going to recommend is I'm going to recommend two approaches that I think are the absolute best approaches in this opening, and two approaches that I think will give you the best possible results. And some of these moves that I'm going to show you, some of them don't actually get played very much, so there's a lot of surprise value in some of these moves. So let's just get started. So the main line is e5, h6, bishop d2, bishop c3, bc3, knight e4, and now we have a very critical move in the MacCutcheon. We have the move queen g4. And what this does is it puts pressure on g7, and it forces black to defend this pawn either with the move g6 or the move king f8. So these two moves both get played, and they get played with about the same amount of frequency, and we're going to go over both of them. So the first move that we're going to go over is we're actually going to go over the move king to f8. So after king f8, you can play this interchangeably. You can play bishop d3, or you can play the move h4 first. I don't think it makes much of a difference in terms of theory. Knight takes d2, king takes d2, d5, h4, and you'd be in the exact same spot either way. And then after the move knight c6, rook h3, c4, they really need to do this when you play rook h3 because they don't want you coordinating a rook g3 with a bishop h7 or something equally nasty. So then bishop e2, and then you're going to play b5, and this is a huge decision point here for white. Basically, white needs to decide if he wants to attack the black king with pawns right away, or if he wants to attack the black king with pieces. He basically needs to decide how to set up his pieces for the attack. And I think there's two approaches here that are highly reasonable. I think the first approach is you can play queen f4, and you can just continue with assaulting pawns right away. You can just play g4, g5, etc. And the second approach is you put your rook on f3 or g3, and I personally prefer f3, because I think if you play rook f3, that's less stuff to get out of the way later if you do decide to play queen f4 and g4, which I think is the eventual plan. So I think rook f3 is the way to go, and then you're going to play knight h3 to f4 to h5, and then you're eventually just going to play queen f4 and you're going to play g4, and you're going to continue attacking that way. So let's just take a look at the first approach, because I think this is reasonable. So queen f4, bishop d7, g4. And you're just going to attack this black king with pawns, and as you can see, this is just what happens in the MacCutcheon. White just attacks the king side like crazy, and black just attacks the queen side like crazy, and white's king is in the middle of the board, so it's loose. But for whatever reason, white usually ends up coming out on top here, because white has better pieces, he has more space, and he has the ability to have this sustained attack. As long as he can figure out how to defend himself and how not to get into too much trouble, he usually comes out on top in all these variations. So there was a game that went b4, and we're following actually a pretty high-level game here. And I'll show you kind of how wild things got in this game. So white decided to do some stuff on the queen side. And as you can see, black's getting a lot of counterplay over here. But white manages to hold it together. And then he plays this move. He keeps playing on the queen side because he needs to kick this queen out of the queen side. And at this point, white just started trying to hold his center together. So then queen c7, rook e3, just holding the center together, d4, rook e4, and as crazy as this position looks, black threatens a fork. White actually holds it all together. He's up a pawn now, and he allows this fork on d5 because, of course, black's queen is hanging as well. This is just standard fare for the MacCutcheon. You know, you've got both sides' kings are unsafe. Black is severely underdeveloped because this rook on h8 can never come out into the game, and you've just got wild tactics all over the board. But in this particular game, even though white completely allowed the tactic knight d5 check, notice it doesn't matter. His queen's hanging too. And after all of these complications and after blocking all of this stuff, he manages to simplify the position, just trading off pieces, trading off pawns. Everything comes off the board. And after all the dust has settled, Black just had to resign because he was just down 2 pawns and his king was still horribly weak and he had no way to fix it. And this was in Eroshenko versus Yemlin in St. Petersburg, Russia in 2009. So certainly playing the move, so just playing the move Queen F4 and then following that up with pawn attacks with like the move G4, etc. is certainly one way to go. So you can play the move Queen H4. So the alternative is the move Rook to F3. And actually I like this alternative a little bit better just because it's trickier. I like things that are tricky. Because at a certain point, like after say Bishop D7, Knight H3, this is a really critical moment. Actually, if Black doesn't bring his knight back with the move Knight E7 to F5, Black is probably completely losing here already. The move Knight to F4 to G6 or Knight to F4 to H5 is such a devastating threat here that Black has to bring his material back right away. And if he doesn't do it, you can win a lot of quick games. I like winning quick games. So I kind of like this variation. And also, my king doesn't end up as loose or as crazy in these lines. And I can attack with everything. Everything I love about an opening. I get tricks, I get to attack with everything, and the counterattack isn't as severe. So Knight E7, Knight F4, Knight F5, Black just has to do this. He's got to bring this knight over here to hold it all together. And then you kind of just have to play Rook H1, and then of course Black can continue with his assault. He can play A4, and then you bring your knight into H5, and just look at how you're attacking with absolutely everything. Right now, Black has 2 choices to defend here. He can either play Rook H7 or Rook G8. I'm not sure which one is better, but we're just going to go with Rook G8 for now, so you can see a sample variation. Queen F4, and remember what I said before was you put the rook on H3 so that you have less to get out of the way for G4, because that's really the only way you're going to be able to continue your assault in the long run, is to play the idea G4. So now after B4, you're going to play G4, and of course they take, and you play King C1. So that's the other thing I like about this. I feel like I can always defend with Bishop D1. I've got my king kind of in the middle of the board, but I got a huge like kind of blockade in front of me. I feel safer in this position than in the previous one. Even though I think in both cases, I think White has an advantage. So one idea that you'll notice here is it looks like Black can play Knight takes H4, Rook takes H4, and then G5, but it doesn't work, and it doesn't work for a pretty obvious reason. After Knight takes H4, you simply have Queen takes F7 mate. So Knight takes H4 isn't going to work, so they're going to have to play G5 to try to stop things up. And after G5, you're going to have H takes G5, H takes G5, Queen C1, and then Knight takes D4, and at this point, what I recommend is just giving up the exchange. You get it right back. So you can play Knight F6, Knight takes F3, Bishop takes F3, and that's kind of what I like about any position, is just making sure that all the guns are firing and making sure that you have everything in place. Notice that it's not really possible for them to save the exchange here. If they play a move like Rook G7, you're going to play Rook H8, picking up the queen. So they have to give it back. So like, for example, they can play Rook B8, Rook H5. Again, they don't have time. Bishop H4, you can finally pick up your exchange, but then you're playing Rook G5 check. So you give it the exchange, you get the material right back. All the danger, again, is pretty much gone to your king. King F8, they're going to have to run with their king, and I recommend actually kind of running with yours as well. I mean, not right away. I want to play Rook H5. I want to put pressure on their king and make him run. King E7, Rook H7, again, put that pressure on their king. D4, and now I'm just going to play King F1, King G2, and I'm going to get my king nice and safe. And at that point, I feel that White just has all the cards. So like after King F1, Bishop E8, King G2, King D7, we play Queen F4, hitting this pawn, hitting here. They're going to have to run their king again, King C7. But even though their king ran from the king side all the way to the queen side, this is by no means a safe side of the board, because Black has opened up this side of the board. It's wide open. So I feel like White can continue with a sacrificial line himself here. He can play Rook H8, Rook B2, and he can just sacrifice the exchange again, because now getting rid of that light squared bishop leaves Black very weak on the light squares, and I think White just has an advantage here. I think White's king is safe and Black's king isn't. I think that's pretty much what the position boils down to. So I feel like this is advantage White. I feel like this is how you play against King F8. I feel like you can play against King F8 with either that Queen F4 move or with the Rook F3 move. I feel like both of those are options. So the second thing that people can do against Queen to G4 is G6. So after Queen to G4, G6, again, Bishop D3, and again, H4 is an alternative, and I think it amounts to pretty much the same thing. I think you end up in the same spot. So you can play H4 here, you can play it move previously. So then C5, and then here I'm going to give a really weird recommendation. This is a superstar novelty. This is a really cool idea. It's not a novelty, it's been played before, but it's very rare. And it's just a really neat idea. I like the idea of playing this move. and it's the move h5, g5, and then knight e2. And I know this looks weird. Did we just sacrifice this bishop on d3? Yes, we did. We actually did it on purpose. We actually want black to play c4. And this is a really weird idea. Of course, black doesn't have to play c4. There was one game where black played queen a5, and then white just took on c5, and white ended up winning that game. So we're not going to go over that. You probably are curious, how can we sacrifice this bishop and survive? So c4, bishop to g6. And the point is this is actually going to be a really dangerous passed pawn. When black takes and white takes back, this passed pawn is extremely dangerous, and it's very difficult to stop. And again, much like in the previous lines with the king on f8, we're going to have the advantage of being able to attack with all of our stuff. The rook is going to come over to f1, the pawn is going to come to f4, and we're going to have all the guns firing over here, helping this very dangerous passed g-pawn if he does in fact decide to capture with a move like, say, fg6, hg6, queen e7. We can play f4, continuing our assault on that side of the board, bishop d7, fg5, and all of our pieces are going to come over to support this. We've got rook f1, knight f4, etc. So like an example would be they could play h5 and we could just ignore it and play knight f4. And they're not going to be able to play h takes g4 because we're going to take and we're going to play g7 and they have to resign. So what could they play instead of h takes g4? Where they could get out of the middle and they could play castles queenside. And a lot of people think, well, this just solved my problems, right? I castled queenside. No, it does not. Knight takes h5, and you still have to deal with these two passed pawns. Bishop e8, g7, rook g8, g6, and believe it or not, black's position is basically frozen at this point. Black has almost nothing that he can do. These pawns are actually completely freezing black's position. He basically is just reduced to shuffling pieces. So like king b8, rook af1, and then the whole goal of this position is basically just to find a way to get this knight to f6, where you're queening. So you've got to get kind of this rook to f6 or this rook to f7, and something's got to give. So for example, a6, you would play rook f6, and the point is you're attacking e6. So how does he deal with it? How does he defend? If he plays a move like bishop d7, now of course we're giving up the f7 square. We're just going to continue with the move rook f7, and then after a move like, say, queen f3, knight f6 is just winning. So his alternative to bishop d7 is what? He just shuffles pieces. He could play king e8, and then we just simply play queen takes e6. And now we've got more pawns and we've got more passed pawns. So queen e6, queen e6. He hasn't really solved his problem, and he still can't stop shuffling because notice these passed pawns are still here. This rook is completely trapped. This bishop is immobilized. So now rook c8, rook f8 is completely winning. This will just be a winning position for white. It's game over, you know. And these passed pawns are just gonna prove themselves. Okay, so that's one idea in that line. So if we go back kind of to the beginning of that line, c4, bishop g6, there's this, you know, best play option. You know, so people always ask, like, what happens if they just play the absolute best? Well, best is probably to play a move like knight e7 and actually delay capturing on g6, because you actually don't want the passed g-pawn. Because I think all the lines with the passed g-pawn, that passed g-pawn is super strong. But what white can do here is white can get a passed h-pawn, and this just goes to show you how little compensation white actually needs to have a major, compensation for his piece here. So for example, we could play a move like f4, just continuing to build up pressure, f takes g6, and then I think either rook a to f1 or f takes g5. I think they're about the same, but I think my recommendation is actually rook a to f1, and then we're going to have the move rook g8, and we're going to have f takes g5, knight f5, g takes h6, knight h6, queen f3, and then g5. So this is really interesting. You actually end up with this passed h-pawn, and you can actually exchange queens here without reducing your pressure. And this is kind of weird. Queen f6, rook f6, knight f7, and then all this is kind of tied down at this point. So here you need to play rook h f1, and then after rook g7, you can play rook g6. And the move rook g6 again threatens to get that super dangerous passed g-pawn, and they don't want that. So they're going to have to play rook h7, and then you're going to play the move g4. And just having this protected passed h-pawn on h5 this is actually going to tie down black's pieces in much the same way that we saw in that previous line. So then after a move like, say, b6, we can play knight g1 with the idea of bringing our knight to h3 and hitting g5. And then after king e7, we would play knight h3. And this is all just kind of a game of how do we get our king lined up in such a way so that we can take on g5 in such a way to make the g and h pawns very, very dangerous. And that can just kind of be a dance, like after bishop g2, rook f2, rook e8 would be an example, king e3, rook f8. And then at this point, I think white's position is fine even if he just shuffles pieces. Like he could just play rook f6, rook f2, and just take a draw. I don't think there's anything that black can do to improve his position, because if he does anything in these types of positions, something's going to give. We're either going to be able to take on g5 with no consequence, or something else is going to give. So the other option that white has is white can try to play for a win here by capturing. And then after this exchange, notice that I tried to exchange the rook on f2 because I want to create like a clear path for my king to help out my passed pawns. I think this is already very difficult for black to deal with these pawns. You know, one example would be is if we had a position like this and I just played the move rook g7. How do you deal with that check? Because obviously if you block the check, you're going to run into the move g5 followed by g6. And I'm getting my piece back. And if you do the king move, if you move your king, I'm going to play rook takes a7, and then these pawns are going to get really dangerous. I'm threatening to play g5 and h6 down the road. And white can kind of improve his position this way. So this is kind of like the idea is white sacrifices a piece, but in exchange he's getting these dangerous passed pawns on the king side. And it's not at all clear how black can deal with these passed pawns, not just short term, but even long term. I mean, even if you get into these types of positions where a lot of pieces has been exchanged, dealing with these two passed pawns is still very, very difficult. It's not clear how black can, have a good position. It's not clear how black can stop these pawns from advancing in the long run. Okay, so that's the MacCutcheon variation. That's part 1 of my 4-part series. I hope this video was helpful, and I hope you learned something new about chess. Thank you very much for watching.